Welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we are embarking on a deep dive into an ancient battlefield mystery, one that ends with literally one of literature's most heartbreaking, unexpected twists. We're going to be looking at the immediate aftermath of the death of King Saul, specifically in the biblical text of 2 Samuel chapter 1. It's a story packed with political intrigue, opportunistic battlefield scavenging, and honestly, a breathtaking display of raw human grief.
Okay, let's dive into this. Right off the bat, if you're reading the text closely, you're going to run into a massive historical discrepancy. I mean, it's a glaring contradiction sitting right there in the pages of the Bible regarding one of the most famous kings in history. And the question is, who actually delivered the fatal blow to King Saul on Mount Gilboa?
That brings us to Section 1, the battlefield mystery. To figure this whole thing out, we have to look at the chaotic, bloody aftermath of the battle. The Israelites have just been completely routed by the Philistines. Meanwhile, down in the city of Ziklag, David, who, remember, has been on the run for his life from Saul for years, is just anxiously waiting for news. And then, on the third day, this mysterious messenger arrives.
Now here is where the textual collision happens. If you read 1 Samuel chapter 31, the narrator tells us plainly that Saul, who's been gravely wounded by Philistine archers, asks his armor-bearer to finish him off. When the armor-bearer refuses, Saul falls on his own sword. He essentially commits suicide. But turn the page to 2 Samuel chapter 1, and this Amalekite messenger arrives in David's camp, claiming he delivered the killing blow. These two accounts just seem completely, totally incompatible.
You know, academics, like the scholar Bill T. Arnold, have wrestled with this enigma for years. Are we dealing with two completely different, incompatible historical source texts that some later editor just lazily jammed together? Or are we looking at a much darker story of political intrigue and deception? Well, the answer really lies in looking a lot closer at this messenger's story.
Let's actually walk through the Amalekite's exact story step by step. First, he shows up with torn clothes and dirt on his head, which are the traditional signs of mourning. Second, he claims he chanced upon Mount Gilboa and found Saul leaning on his spear, totally surrounded by enemy chariots. Third, he states Saul begged him to end his life, so he delivered the death blow. And finally, step 4, and honestly this is the kicker, he presents physical evidence. He hands David the royal crown and the armband, so he was definitely there. But was he actually telling the truth?
Which brings us to Section 2, a calculated political lie. Let's treat this Amalekite story like an active crime scene investigation, because when we look at the facts and the surrounding context, the messenger's true motives start to become incredibly crystal clear.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it breaks down the psychology of a fatal lie. This Amalekite was almost certainly a battlefield scavenger. He likely stumbled upon Saul's already dead body and just stripped it of the royal insignia. So why lie and say he killed the king? Well, it's pure political calculation and opportunistic advancement. He knew Saul had been relentlessly hunting David. He figured David would be absolutely thrilled that his arch-rival was finally dead and would obviously reward the guy who claimed to have finished the job. But man, this was a massive, fatal moral misreading of David's character.
And hey, this isn't just a modern hot take. The broad academic consensus, from renowned scholars like P. Kyle McCarter and Bill T. Arnold, concludes that the biblical author deliberately portrayed the Amalekite as a prevaricator, a liar. Essentially, the text of 1 Samuel tells us what actually happened. Saul fell on his sword, while 2 Samuel tells us the fabricated story the Amalekite used to try and curry royal favor.
So let's look at Section 3, an unexpected royal reaction. The Amalekite proudly presents the crown, right? He's expecting a handsome reward, a promotion, maybe even a cushy place in David's new royal court. But let's pivot to the thematic contrast here, because what happens next is the exact complete opposite of what he expected.
David doesn't throw a party. He doesn't pop champagne. The text says David literally took hold of his clothes and tore them. He and all the men with him wept and fasted until evening. Just think about the astonishing grace happening right here. David is genuinely, deeply mourning the man who had jealously hunted him across the desert like an animal for years. There is absolutely zero bitterness in David's response. Moving into Section 4, Justice for the Anointed. This brings us to the theological turning point of our explainer. Because after fasting and weeping all day, David summons the Amalekite messenger back. And instead of handing him a bag of gold, David hands him a death sentence. To understand why he does this, we really have to look at a core ancient Hebrew concept.
It's the concept of mashiach YHWH, the Lord's anointed. This idea is the theological heartbeat of David's entire life. To David, the anointed king is utterly untouchable, and this is absolutely crucial. It's not because of Saul's personal merit.
Saul was a deeply flawed, often wicked king, but he had a divine designation. David refused to kill Saul when he had the chance himself because he firmly believed only God could remove a king God had installed.
So David uses a classic Hebrew legal formula here, telling the Amalekite, "Your blood is on your own head because your own mouth testified against you when you said, 'I killed the anointed of the Lord.'" The irony here is just incredible, isn't it? The Amalekite almost certainly didn't kill Saul. He just lied about it to get rich. But that very calculated, self-serving lie is exactly what condemned him to an immediate execution.
All right, Section 5, the Song of the Bow. With the lying messenger dealt with, we transition into the second act of this chapter, the elegy. This is David's formal, public, poetic response to the horrific tragedy of Mount Gilboa, and I'm telling you, it is an absolute masterpiece of ancient literature.
Now, the text introduces the poem by saying it's recorded in the Book of Jashar. The fascinating thing is, the Book of Jashar is an ancient collection of Israelite heroic poetry that is completely lost to history today. We literally only have a couple of fragments of it quoted in the Bible. But its inclusion right here makes this poem the oldest securely datable piece of writing in the entire Davidic corpus. It's a remarkably authentic window directly into the past.
The poem itself is called a kina in Hebrew. It's a formal lament, or a dirge. And what makes this so incredibly brilliant linguistically is that it's written in a distinctive 3-2 meter. Basically, you have a longer first line of 3 beats, immediately followed by a shorter second line of 2 beats. This creates what scholars call a limping meter. As you read it aloud in Hebrew, the rhythm actually stumbles. It perfectly mimics the physical sensation of a person just collapsing under the crushing weight of grief.
And this brilliantly illustrates the emotional core of the lament, how the mighty have fallen. You've probably heard that phrase, right? It's one of the most famous refrains in all of world literature, and it originates right here in this very text. David weaves this haunting phrase through the poem 3 separate times, just echoing his profound, continuous shock that the invincible heroes of Israel have actually been struck down.
But you know what the most shocking thing about this poem is, especially coming from someone like David? If you read through the whole thing, you will find absolutely no mention of God. Zero. There is no neat theological explanation for the disaster. There's no appeal to divine justice. David, a man who usually attributes literally every single thing in his life to God, simply renders his raw earthly loss as pure art. Some commentators actually suggest that this silence is its own profound theological statement, that sometimes losses are just too large and too painful for easy religious platitudes. Now within the poem, David graciously honors both men, but he does it in very different ways. He honors King Saul for his military might, symbolized by his sword, and for the economic prosperity he brought, telling the daughters of Israel to weep for the king who clothed them in gold and scarlet. He gives Saul his due, but his words for Saul's son, Jonathan, the one who used the bow, are deeply, intimately personal. Jonathan wasn't just a prince, he was David's covenant brother, and David's devastation here is absolute.
Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. Now, we really need to understand the cultural context of this famous line to get what he's saying. David is praising Jonathan's selfless, transparent goodness. I mean, think about it. Jonathan was the crown prince. By all ancient political logic, he should have seen David as a massive rival to the throne and killed him. But instead, he loved him.
Commentators and historians are very careful to clarify that this isn't describing a sexual relationship. Rather, it represents the absolute pinnacle of platonic covenantal loyalty. Remember, David had wives, but in his experience, those relationships often came with heavy political expectations or entanglements. Jonathan's love was a pure, completely unblemished partnership. Jonathan voluntarily renounced his own right to the throne, risking his own life and his royal future simply to protect his best friend. That is a kind of loyalty that David found entirely unmatched in his life. Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway from this ancient text. David spent his prime years hunted like an animal by Saul. Yet when the tyrant finally fell, David didn't celebrate. He wept, he honored the man's office, and he actively chose to remember the good. So the lingering question for us today is this. When you face the downfall of someone who has deeply, deeply wronged you, will you use it as an opportunity to become better, or will you let it make you bitter? Think on that. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I will see you next time.